Lisa Damour is one of the leading psychologists, especially of adolescents, working in the US, and we're delighted that she's published a piece for us at the American Institute for Boys and Men called Boys Are Suffering Too, Here's Why We Miss That. Lisa, thank you so much for writing your piece for the American Institute for Boys and Men on why boys are suffering and why we might miss that. Why did you think that was an important piece for you to write for us, and given that you're an expert on what's happening more generally in this space?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to write it and for placing it on your wonderful new platform. The reason I thought it was important to write about the ways in which boys are suffering is because boys are people. And I think we have found ourselves in a discourse where we are talking a lot about the ways in which girls suffer and the ways in which women suffer. This is all true. I would never take away from that. But I worry that we're talking about that to the exclusion sometimes of also talking about the ways in which boys are having a hard time. And it's something I observe clinically. It's something I hear about from the families I come into contact with. I spend a lot of time at schools. And so I think it's a story that needs to be told.
Thank you. And you mentioned 3 specific reasons why there might be some suffering among adolescent boys that we're missing, kind of in particular. And the first is that just in the way that surveys are designed. Could you say a bit more about that?
Sure. And here I'm thinking of sort of the large-scale surveys that get a lot of press. We have surveys that are very good at picking up distress across all genders. But for instance, the YRBS, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is the basis of the CDC survey, or is used by the CDC, when it asks about psychological discomfort or distress, it actually asks really only one key question, which is around sadness or hopelessness. This is an important question. We also know it's more likely to pick up distress in girls. One of our cardinal rules in psychology is that girls internalize, boys externalize. Girls collapse in on themselves with anxiety and depression. Boys tend to act out, get themselves in trouble when they're suffering. So my proposal here is that we just widen the lens a little bit and ask the kinds of questions that will let us know how boys are doing, or more likely to let us know how boys are doing. And the kinds of questions would be things like asking about anger or irritability. We know that boys are socialized to express distress this way. And we need to ask about it, and we need to see it as a precursor for greater mental health concerns.
The second reason that you cite is what you call observational bias, and you use that lovely story of the person looking for their lost keys under the lamppost because the light is better there. But what is the kind of bias that we might see here that might lead us to just inadvertently miss some male forms of suffering?
So one of the things I've observed is that we sort of end up sometimes in conversational ruts or research ruts. And it's not, ill-intentioned, it just happens. So on the research side, we have familiar areas of research. I'm a clinical psychologist, social scientist. We have things that we research and have researched for a long time. When we talk about adolescent suffering, it tends to be things like depression, anxiety, eating disorders, self-harm, established lines of research, which have established bodies of scholarship, which have labs that are up and running and studying those things, which have grad students coming into those labs and studying those things. So the way we do things is sort of designed for us to continue to look at the things we have already looked at. What we're seeing is that boys are showing us new ways of suffering, or suffering that we have not studied robustly on the academic side. So it's things like compulsive video game use or compulsive gambling, I think is a much bigger issue than anyone's talking about. Or compulsive pornography use, especially looking at violent pornography. These are really important. I think there's a lot of evidence sort of anecdotally that this is how boys are letting us know they're struggling. But these are not well-established research lines in the academy. And so they don't get the attention or probably the funding or the interest that would help us really start to wrap our hands around the details of this phenomenology.
So there's something of a vicious cycle there, which I think we see in some of the other work the Institute does too, is that there isn't a research base on a particular issue, which means there isn't as much knowledge or attention drawn to it, which means it doesn't get picked up as much, which means it's hard to get funding to do research on it. And it sounds like that's what you're describing in this case as well.
I think that's exactly right. And I think, it gets to the third thing I raised in...
Yeah, this is the one where you say that the way that the boys express suffering is unappealing, less somewhat. Would that be a fair way to characterize the third issue?
I think so. It can be off-putting. It can be off-putting. And again, this is socialization. There's nothing genetic in boys that makes this true. There's nothing broken in boys that makes this true. It's that we socialize boys to not express vulnerability, to express distress through anger or through pleasure at someone else's expense. We don't allow boys the full range of emotional experience. They live on a very narrow emotional highway in terms of sanctioned ways of expressing distress. And so the kinds of things that boys are doing that let me know they are struggling are things that are also often pretty off-putting. So being really into following heavily misogynistic content, taking an interest in pornography, being interested in like losing themselves sometimes in what are very violent video games, getting caught up in gambling, things like that. It is hard at times to extend a great deal of compassion for a young person whose interests are going down these lines that are not that socially acceptable, often quite dark. And I think that that's what it really requires, though. I mean, one of the things I love about being a clinical psychologist is that all behavior makes sense. People do things for reasons, even if on the surface the reason does not seem abundantly clear. No one works entirely against their own interests. And so we have to see it this way, and we have to be open to seeing it this way.
Yeah. Harder when it seems antisocial, as you're saying, but it's really a reflection of what's happening inside, even though it's showing up on the outside. So if I'm listening to this conversation, or I'm reading your piece for us on boys are suffering and how we miss that, if I'm a policymaker or a scholar or a survey designer, I'm at CDC, I'm making policy, or I'm thinking about researching, what should be my takeaways? What should I do differently as a result of your insight?
So on the survey side, I would just say add at least one question about anger or irritability. We only have one question about sadness and hopelessness, and everybody saw how many headlines that single question garnered about the suffering in girls. I also think it's important that in adding a question like that, we help the public connect the dots that anger and irritability is distress in boys. This is suffering in boys. This is not naughtiness in boys. So I think that's important. I think there needs to be research, funding for the kinds of concerning behavior that boys are showing us. I think we need to take it seriously. I think we need to treat it as societally critical, both because we care about boys and often because when boys are struggling, they're hard on the people around them. And a lot of those times, those are girls.
Yeah. And if you're a parent, an educator, someone kind of with a boy in your life, I'm very clearly not hearing you say there's any reason to worry less about girls and kind of young women. It seems like the message here is more about rebalancing. But if I'm a parent of a son and a daughter, what might I think differently than I would have just from picking up the general discourse as a result of what you've said?
What I hear from parents and educators is they see a disconnect between the discourse and what they're looking at with the boys in front of them. They are worried about their boys. They are aware that there are concerning behaviors that are taking up a lot more space in these boys' lives than anyone is talking about. So what I would say to parents and educators is trust your gut. What you're seeing is important. Take that seriously. And to the degree that a boy is acting in a way that is problematic and off-putting, sometimes a disciplinary response is needed. People need to be kept safe, but that should always be followed up with curiosity. What's behind it? What purpose is it serving? Is this a form of coping? Is this a form of numbing? Is this something that the boy himself feels is out of control? I think so often, my job is to care for teenagers. So often adults discount the fact that the teenager has worries about themselves. And if you're going to make good progress in helping them get things on the right track, starting with their own concerns, plenty of boys will tell you that they feel out of control in terms of their use of games or gambling or pornography. So if we can come at this with compassion, we can do a lot more to support the boys that we love.
So your piece for us is called Boys Are Suffering Too. Here's How We Miss That. Thank you again for writing it for us, and thanks again for your comments today.
Of course. Thank you for the opportunity.